Welcome to the Mindset Matters Book Club YouTube channel. Please subscribe to hear new book summaries. Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into a classic book that dissects one of history's most compelling questions. Why do otherwise sensible people suddenly join a crowd of believers, whether they're chasing mythical fortunes or, hiding from imaginary comets?
It's a fantastic question, and this deep dive is all about extraordinary popular delusions and the madness of crowds. Our mission today is really to extract the universal laws of crowd psychology from its pages.
That sounds ambitious.
It is, but this book is incredible. It synthesizes centuries of human credulity, covering everything from, catastrophic financial panics to these profound social hysterias and the persistence of pseudoscientific beliefs.
So we're kind of creating a shortcut for our listeners.
Exactly. A powerful shortcut to recognizing the enduring patterns of human folly and the madness that results from collective enthusiasm.
We've got a huge amount of ground to cover. We're spanning 3 centuries and several continents. We're going to structure this exploration into 3 major waves of popular delusion.
Right.
We'll start with the financial and speculative manias, where greed really took center stage. Then we'll move into the social and spiritual terrors that gripped entire societies.
And we'll finish up by looking at the persistence of pseudoscientific quackery and, magical thinking.
Sounds like 3 very different topics.
You'd think so, but the central insight of this book is that these seemingly disparate events, a financial crash in France, a witch trial in Sweden, a flower craze in Holland, they are all powered by the same psychological engine.
Which is what?
It's the human desire for the extraordinary, for a shortcut around reality. That's the thread that binds them all together.
That is the core theme. Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the biggest spectacles of greed and speculation that literally altered the course of history. Financial madness. We should probably begin with a figure who is as much an adventurer and a gambler as he is an economist. John Law.
Oh, John Law is a fascinating study in character. He was a Scottish visionary who arrives in France to solve its national debt crisis.
But he wasn't just some dry economist.
Not at all. He was known for his incredible skill in, and the book calls it, the intricacies of chance. He wasn't just good at cards. He was so dangerous to public morals that magistrates in Venice and Genoa expelled him.
They literally kicked him out.
Yes. They deemed him a visitor too dangerous for the youth of those cities. And this is the man who proposes to fix an entire nation's finances.
What's crucial, though, and I think we need to be fair here, is that his economic idea, using paper currency backed by national resources, was theoretically pretty sound.
Oh, absolutely. He was right that commerce needed a more flexible medium than just metal coin. His fatal flaw, was his inability to anticipate the psychology of the crowd he was about to unleash.
And the foreshadowing is just perfect. Before he even gets to the King of France, he takes the idea to Victor Amadeus, the Duke of Savoy.
Right. And the Duke rejects him, but with a quote that, it should be inscribed above every stock exchange on the planet.
What did he say?
He told Law that his own kingdom was far too poor a potentate to be ruined, and then he advised him to try France because he believed the French would be delighted with a plan not only so new, but so plausible.
Novelty and plausibility. That's the recipe right there for a speculative mania.
It's the perfect storm. So Law launches the Mississippi Scheme, which combines the national bank with a trading company, linking the future wealth of the French colonial empire in Louisiana to the value of this new paper money.
And this one single scheme creates a frenzy unlike anything the world had ever seen before.
The speed at which Law became the most powerful man in France is just astonishing. At the height of the mania, his residence, the Hôtel de Soissons, was the center of the universe.
This is where everyone wanted to be.
Peers, judges, bishops, the absolute elite of French society. They forsook the regent's own antechambers just to throng Law's halls. People were waiting 6 hours just for a chance to speak to him or, get on his stock lists.
The attempts people made to get his attention were just theatrical, almost comical, if they weren't so desperately serious.
It really shows the total sacrifice of dignity for the sake of potential wealth.
And the most famous example of that has to be the Lady of Rank.
Oh, the story's incredible. She's utterly exasperated by the delays, stuck in her carriage outside the Hôtel de Soissons, so she pulls the cord and calls out to her driver.
Upset us now. For God's sake, upset us now.
Exactly. Her logic was that if she were injured right outside his door, Law would be obliged by social custom to see her immediately and presumably reward her with some stock.
That's how completely financial mania had just replaced rationality.
He was effectively worshipped. He received floods of adulation from every corner of society. But as is always the case with schemes based on limitless growth, the collapse was, well, it was inevitable.
Because the paper credit far, far outran the actual underlying wealth.
The figures are just staggering. When the council met in May, they determined there were 2,600 million livres of notes in circulation. The total amount of actual coin in the country was less than half that amount.
So there was just no way to back it up.
No. There was simply no way the physical economy could circulate that quantity of paper. The paper money was fundamentally unbacked and therefore completely unstable.
And the government's response just shows the sheer panic they were in.
Total panic. They tried to fix the problem by fiat, issuing an edict that all banknotes should be gradually depreciated by half over a year.
So they were basically telling people the money in your hand is now worth half of what it was.
And the public reaction was immediate and violent. This wasn't a market correction. This was the government effectively stealing half of everyone's accumulated paper wealth overnight.
The alarm must have been incredible.
It was. And the parliament's refusal to register the edict forced the government into a rapid and humiliating reversal within 7 days.
And that was the breaking point.
That was the day the music stopped. On that very day, the bank stopped what we call specie payment, meaning they stopped exchanging paper notes for metallic coin, for gold or silver. That was the moment the public lost all trust.
The adoration instantly curdled into public hatred.
Instantly. The very same mob that had showered him with flowers now assailed his carriage with stones. Laud had to take refuge first with his Swiss guards, then in the regent's apartments, and he finally fled France, almost a beggar.
But here is where we get to a key insight. The book argues pretty convincingly that Laud was not a knave, not a liar, or a simple con artist.
Right. It poses the question, was his failure economic, or was it a fatal misjudgment of human nature?
And the book lands on psychology.
Absolutely. It was psychological. He genuinely believed his scheme would work, and the evidence supports this. Unlike the dishonest jobbers who shrewdly converted their paper profits into hard assets and sent them overseas, Laud invested all of his enormous gains directly into French landed property.
So he tied his own personal fortune to the country's stability.
Exactly. His folly was not moral treachery, but the blinding self-confidence of a mathematician who just fundamentally underestimated the irrational fear and greed of millions.
That sets the stage perfectly for the simultaneous yet uniquely English catastrophe, the South Sea Bubble. We shift across the channel where the speculative energy was even more decentralized and chaotic.
That's a good way to put it. The South Sea Company was a scheme to absorb the national debt in exchange for exclusive trading rights in South America. But its true significance lies in the 100 or so smaller bubbles it inspired.
And the author has a great line for this.
He does. He says these schemes were set on foot and promoted by crafty knaves, then pursued by multitudes of covetous fools. The knaves provided the structure, but the fools provided the mass energy.
This high credulity environment allowed for the most ridiculous projects to thrive, and it reveals a core law of delusion. When greed is intense enough, the object of investment doesn't need to be plausible, just novel.
We have evidence of just phenomenal absurdity. Consider schemes like a company to make deal boards out of sawdust.
Out of sawdust? I mean, come on.
I know, an endeavor with obviously limited technical feasibility, or the scheme for encouraging the breed of horses in England and improving of glebe and church lands.
Which suggests even the clergy were getting in on it.
The book points out it was likely fox hunting parsons, showing how even they abandoned prudence for profit.
But the height of madness, the moment when rationality completely left the building, was the project for carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is.
It's unbelievable. An unknown adventurer simply sets up an office, requests a £2 deposit per share, with the promise of a £100 per annum return.
And people bought it.
The public, gripped by the fear of missing out, besieged his office and happily paid their deposits for a business they literally knew nothing about, expecting a 50-fold return. That speculator vanished that very evening.
Wow.
And yet, the appetite for these hardly or more reasonable schemes continued unabated.
The financial realities, though, they mirrored what was happening in France.
They did. Mr. Broderick, a member of Parliament, observed the sheer impossibility of it all. He said 10 millions, which is more than our running cash, could not circulate 200 millions, beyond which our paper credit extended.
So the paper structure was 10 times larger than the physical economy.
Or more. Once the confidence broke, the stock plummeted, leading to rage beyond description. The parliamentary inquiry targeted high officials for notorious and dangerous corruption. The calamity was laid squarely at the feet of the directors.
So it wasn't just individual investors who were ruined.
Not at all. The faith in the entire English financial system was shattered.
The cleanup required a massive political effort by Robert Walpole, right?
Right. He used an incredibly complex plan to restore credit by ingrafting 9 million of South Sea stock into the Bank of England and the East India Company. It wasn't just accounting, it was a political sleight of hand.
A way to distribute the financial damage.
Exactly. Across the established, trustworthy institutions. It stabilized the market not by fixing the scheme, but by diluting the ruin.
So if we pause here to synthesize these two huge financial manias, what's the common law?
The common law is clear. The invention of paper credit, while revolutionary, created an unparalleled canvas for the collective imagination. It allowed for the quantification of fantasy, attracting the highest aristocrats and the common jobber alike. And only the intervention of external reality, the inability of the notes to deliver coin, finally broke the spell.
That deep collective drive for the extraordinary, for wealth without work, leads us to the most bizarre speculative mania of all, where the object of obsession had zero intrinsic value, zero scarcity, and zero function beyond aesthetics. The contagious mania of the tulip in Holland.
This is a perfect psychological case study. The object of desire was a fragile flower, and specifically the most coveted bulbs were those weakened by cultivation and variegated by a virus, essentially a disease that made them beautiful but incredibly perishable.
So the most valuable ones were the sickest ones.
That's it. The pursuit of the fragile and ephemeral over the robust and useful defines the flurly.
And the fervor quickly eclipsed all rationality. By 1634, the ordinary industry of Holland was just neglected.
The entire population, even to its lowest dregs, became tulip traders. People were spending a fortune of 100,000 florins just to buy 40 roots by 1635.
The focus became microscopic.
It did. Roots were no longer measured by physical count or size, but by their weight in parrots. A parrot is a minute measure, less than a grain. This is the financial equivalent of valuing an asset based on an increasingly irrelevant technical metric to justify an astronomical price.
We see that today.
All the time. When speculative markets focus intensely on transaction speed or, artificial scarcity rather than underlying utility.
The economic distortion this caused is almost impossible to grasp without looking at the direct exchanges. The book provides a devastating list of what a single rare root was valued at.
It's astounding. One single root was exchanged for 4 fat oxen, 12 fat sheep, 2 hogsheads of wine, 1,000 pounds of cheese, and a complete bed.
Think about that.
I mean, they were trading the foundations of a successful household food, comfort livestock, for a single diseased plant bulb. The whole concept of value was completely inverted.
And what's fascinating here is the complete democratization of the madness.
Everyone was in on it. Nobles, citizens, farmers, mechanics, and even chimney sweeps and old clothes women were all involved. They sold houses and lands at ruinously low prices to invest, convinced that this frenzy, this belief, would last forever.
They even formalized the folly.
They did. They established regular trading marts, complete with special tulip notaries to ratify deals, replacing the traditional public notaries. The trades were confirmed at huge banquets where the valuable tulips were displayed in vases like trophies.
This ritualization and social reinforcement made the collective belief feel legitimate.
Of course. But the pattern of the crash was identical to the Mississippi and South Sea bubbles. At first, everyone gained, which reinforced confidence. But when a few rational players realized the inherent instability, that the bulb was just a bulb, prices collapsed and no one was left to buy.
The collective will could sustain the price, but it couldn't create intrinsic value.
Exactly. This section proves that whether the object is paper credit or a flower, the psychological mechanism of mass delusion driven by avarice remains one of the most powerful economic forces in history.
Okay, moving from the madness of money to the madness of social behavior. We see how the intense popular enthusiasm that ruined nations didn't just disappear. It simply sought a new object for obsession.
That's right. The focus shifts from the market value of a share to the social value of reputation, admiration, or defiance.
This is the adaptability of what you call the crowd engine.
Precisely. Once the mechanism for mass credulity is established, it only needs a new cultural narrative to sustain its energy.
Let's start with a phenomenon unique to that time. The popular admiration for great thieves, the so-called gentlemen of the road. Why would society romanticize figures who were actively undermining it?
The book attributes it to two things: a sympathy for the poor, who are often crushed by the law, and the universal human interest in perilous adventure. The outlaw represented a kind of freedom and defiance.
The Abbé Leblanc, observing this in England, noted that the English were as proud of their highwaymen as they were of their soldiers.
They were, and the veneration became almost spiritualized, especially with the story of Jack Sheppard, who is notorious for his multiple impossible escapes from Newgate prison.
This is where crime becomes an allegory.
It really does. A street preacher actually used Sheppard's physical escapes as an elaborate, practical analogy for achieving spiritual redemption. He recounted in vivid detail how Sheppard picked the padlock with a crooked nail, burst his heavy fetters, climbed a chimney, wrenched out an iron bar, and broke through a stone wall.
And then the sermon turns spiritual.
The preacher urged his listeners to open the locks of your hearts with the nail of repentance, burst asunder the fetters of your beloved lusts, mount the chimney of hope.
The crowd was so hungry for a heroic figure that they accepted religious instruction delivered through the metaphor of a criminal's methodology.
It's incredible. And we see this same fascination with style in Claude Duval, the pink of politeness, who robbed with great courtesy. He was admired because he taught the wild Arabs of the road to rob in a more gentle mode. He refined crime into a social performance.
This fascination with performance and style brings us to a surprisingly fierce social battle. The persistent folly of fashion, specifically battles over long hair and beards, and how authority just failed to enforce compliance.
These conflicts were often proxy wars. In the time of Henry I, the church viewed long ringlets as a scandalum magnatum, a great social and spiritual scandal. They equated short hair with piety and long hair with vanity and sin.
So Serlo, the king's chaplain, delivered a sermon detailing the torments awaiting the vain in the next world.
He did, and he was so frighteningly successful that King Henry wept and allowed Serlo to pull out scissors and publicly cut his hair right there in front of the court.
A huge victory for the church.
A very fleeting victory. The courtiers, feeling humiliated or perhaps less manly, reverted to their long ringlets in less than 6 months. The book concludes that fashion stands firm against a lever, meaning spiritual coercion, which appeals to distant consequences, is no match for immediate vanity and social norm reinforcement.
So if spiritual threats failed, how did Peter the Great of Russia succeed in 1705 in enforcing the removal of beards? What was the difference in his enforcement mechanism?
Peter the Great was pragmatic. He traded damnation for dollars, or rather, rubles. He imposed a tax of 100 rubles on nobles to retain their beards. He wasn't appealing to their souls, he was hitting their wallets.
So you could keep your beard, but it would cost you.
A lot. For priests and serfs, the fee was lower, but it was compulsory every time they entered a city. He generated substantial state revenue this way.
And the ultimate detail is the official receipt coin, the Borodovaya,
which literally featured a nose, a mouth, and a bushy beard, proving the fine had been paid. You had to possess this coin to avoid the wrath of the guards.
So Peter succeeded where the chaplain failed because he used direct, tangible, state-enforced coercion.
Exactly. Backed by the threat of financial penalty and physical violence. The mob's enthusiasm for long hair simply wasn't strong enough to withstand that immediate, tangible punishment. This raises a crucial law of mass psychology. When belief runs up against immediate physical or financial reality, reality usually wins.
Unless the belief is tied to persecution.
Which is a whole other story we'll get to.
Our final look at social madness is the terrifying and absolute absurdity of dueling, where the concept of honor became completely divorced from sanity or morality.
This really reveals how social systems can institutionalize mass folly. The strange law in Malta is a perfect example. Dueling was permitted, but only in one specific street. And combatants were legally required to drop their swords if requested by a priest, a knight, or a woman.
You would hope high society would step in to stop it.
But the book notes that knights often sympathized with the wounded honor of the duelist, and women were too frequently the original cause of the duel. So it fell primarily to the priests to act as peacemakers.
The level of triviality that could trigger mortal combat is just shocking.
It is. Consider the 1765 duel between Lord Byron and Mr. Chaworth, fought across a table by candlelight using swords. The dispute, whose estates had the largest quantity of game.
They were risking their lives over a bragging contest about hunting.
And the tragic result was Mr. Chaworth's mortal wound. The inquiry convicted Byron of manslaughter only. This is the crucial social consequence. The law treated murder as a mere social misunderstanding if it was framed as an affair of honor.
It sent a very bad example for the country.
And we see the ultimate barbarism in the dueling among German university students. Their ambition was not merely to win, but to disfigure opponents by cutting off their noses with swords, turning violence and permanent injury into a grotesque status symbol.
Scars themselves were badges of courage and entitlement.
The collective valuation of a superficial concept like honor or style becomes more valuable than physical life itself.
The crowd's need for extraordinary explanations and events shifts dramatically when we enter periods of existential threat. This is where we see prophecies, persecution, and pure terror.
Absolutely. The emotional energy that was previously used for greed or status is now directed towards survival and spiritual anxiety.
Credulity is always greatest in times of perceived calamity.
It is. When people feel powerless, they turn away from rational thought and toward prophetic fanatics, even if the prophecy itself is terrifying. The promise of a decisive end is often preferable to prolonged uncertainty.
The most dramatic example of widespread epidemic terror centered around the 10th century regarding the end of days.
Right. Around 950 AD, a panic seized Christendom. Fanatics preached that the 1,000 years prophesied in the apocalypse were about to expire, and the Son of Man was set to appear.
And the reason this spread so effectively was the instability of the time.
Exactly. Europe was still in a period of immense instability, wars, famines, the collapse of established political orders. It was a fertile ground for fear.
The religious architecture of the time, the building of churches and cathedrals, was often delayed or put on hold because people genuinely believed the world would end before they could complete construction. The social and economic impact of this widespread delusion was immense.
And we see the same mechanism centuries later with the 1832 Comet Scare, particularly in Germany. This wasn't a religious panic in the same way, but a scientific prediction translated immediately into spiritual dread.
People feared the comet would be the literal agent of destruction, physically dashing the Earth to atoms.
The alarm was so widespread that many people suspended business. They refrained from undertaking or concluding any significant affairs during that year, believing their earthly efforts were meaningless in the face of imminent catastrophe.
And London had its own persistent cycles of localized terror.
It did. Following two earthquakes exactly 1 month apart in 1761, a soldier named Bell, described as crack-brained, predicted a third definitive shock on April 5th.
And the result was total chaos.
Thousands of panic-stricken fugitives crowded villages like Highgate and Hampstead. People were paying exorbitant prices for refuge or camping out in fields and on merchant ships anchored in the Thames, waiting for St. Paul's to topple.
They believed the word of one soldier over all empirical evidence.
And this mirrored the earlier mass flight of 1524, when astrologers concurred that on February 1st, the Thames would wash away 10,000 houses. By January, at least 20,000 persons had fled London for Kent and Essex. What stands out here is that the crowd shows the spectacular, terrifying prediction over the boring, empirical reality of the river's normal behavior.
This collective willingness to believe the worst, the most dramatic explanation, brings us to perhaps the darkest manifestation of popular delusion, the brutality of the witch trials.
This was a collective fantasy of the devil's kingdom overlaid onto real persecution. The sheer absurdity of the mythology underpinning this horror only emphasizes the madness.
The book details the supposed specifics of the devil's Sabbath.
It does. Satan appeared as a he-goat with a second face on his haunches, and attendees paid their tribute by kissing his posterior face.
The forced rebaptism was equally grotesque, giving the poor accused women ridiculous, debasing names like Blow Kale and Batter Them Down Maggie.
And the one rule of infernal etiquette was that they were strictly prohibited from calling the devil Black John, or he would rush out and beat them. The triviality of the rule stands in stark contrast to the horrific consequences of the trials.
The institutionalized cruelty is captured perfectly in the case of Dr. Fian, a Scottish schoolmaster whose trial was overseen by King James I himself.
After enduring the rack, he was subjected to the severe torture of the boots.
Can you explain the boots torture? Because the description is graphic and vital to understanding the pressure these people were under.
The boots were an instrument that crushed the legs between iron plates. Fian's legs were crushed until the blood and marrow spouted forth in great abundance, and despite his initial confession being extracted under this torture, he retracted it upon being recaptured, which demonstrates his ultimate innocence against the preposterous crimes he was accused of.
The witch mania often culminated in localized catastrophes, like the Mora child murders in Sweden.
This involved one of the most famous and absurd confessions. A witch claimed the parish minister's agonizing headache was caused by her attempting to drive a nail into his skull with a sledgehammer, but failing because his head was so enormously thick.
That shows the mix of fantasy, malice, and grotesque imagination fueling the charges.
And ultimately, 70 people were condemned to death, and 15 children were burned in one fire at Mora alone.
This raises a critical question about the psychology of persecution. Why would the innocent, knowing they were innocent, confess to these elaborate, often horrific crimes?
Sir George Mackenzie, a magistrate, provided the painful answer. He recounted a poor woman who confessed not because she was guilty, but because she had been defamed for a witch.
So no one would help her.
No one would give her meat or lodging. She chose execution rather than starve under relentless social and economic persecution. The social ostracization was a death sentence in itself, making the quick execution preferable to a slow, agonizing death by starvation.
And on top of that, the trials were driven by a mercenary trade.
The witch prickers roamed the country, claiming to find the devil's mark, an insensible spot on the body, using long pins. They were paid a fee for every witch they discovered.
So it created a feedback loop of fraud and violence.
It did. The accused were subjected to severe torture by jailers who truly believed they were doing God's service. Mackenzie was clear. This institutionalized cruelty was the ground of all their confession. In the face of overwhelming pressure and a society that had already condemned them, critical thinking was not only impossible, but suicidal.
We transition now to mankind's attempts to bypass the limits of nature, lifespan, and science itself. We're focusing on alchemy and early forms of pseudoscientific quackery. The search for the philosopher's stone, which promised limitless gold and eternal life, has generated endless, fascinating stories.
What's fascinating is how the alchemists blurred the line between genuine early chemical knowledge and outright mysticism and fraud. The story of Nicholas Flamel, the public scribe, is a foundational tale of the sincere alchemist.
Flamel supposedly found an ancient book written on tree bark and attributed to Abraham, patriarch, Jew, prince, philosopher, priest, Levite, and astrologer. This wasn't a simple recipe book.
No, it was a deeply symbolic document. It was written in elegant Latin, and on the 7th leaves it contained powerful symbolic pictures. A serpent swallowing rods, a crucified serpent on a cross, and a fountain in a desert with crawling serpents.
And this book supposedly guided Flamel not just to wealth, but to wisdom,
allowing him to conduct extensive charitable works in Paris, building churches and hospitals, which attested to his genuine, stable wealth.
Now, you contrast that sincerity with the notorious duo, Dr. D and Edward Kelly, who needed the world to believe in their success, even if they were starving.
They were constantly running scams across Europe. When they were guests of Count Rosenberg in Bohemia, they struggled desperately to conceal their poverty. Kelly understood the marketing problem perfectly.
What was his logic?
He said nobody would believe that they were possessors of the philosopher's stone if it were once suspected that they did not know how to procure bread for their subsistence. The outward appearance of wealth was necessary to perpetuate the myth of the stone's practical reality.
Cornelius Agrippa is another spectacular figure, where the line between showmanship, fraud, and black magic completely dissolves.
Agrippa was the ultimate self-promoter, claiming expertise as a sublime theologian, physician, and alchemist. One legend claims that the gold he used to pay merchants always looked remarkably bright, but it invariably turned into pieces of slate and stone within 24 hours.
Which suggests he mastered the illusion of immediate wealth, but not the actual chemistry.
A persistent detail like that confirms that the devil, or at least his gold, was a poor alchemist.
And the anecdote of the student who trespassed in Agrippa's study is a classic warning about the danger of secret knowledge, whether it's real or imagined.
Right. While Agrippa was away, the student borrowed the key to the study and began reading a powerful grimoire, or book of spells, that lay open. By reading the specific spell, he summoned a powerful demon.
The sheer terror rendered the student mute.
And the summoned demon instantly killed him. It's a parable that underlines the collective anxiety of the era. Dabbling in the mystical is a fatal business.
Switching to the terrifying reality of murderous trade, we look at the quiet, insidious work of the poisoners, starting with aqua tofania in Italy.
Aqua tofania was a chillingly effective product, crystallized arsenic salts dissolved in water, making it slow, tasteless, and limpid. La Tofania's true genius, however, was in her marketing and distribution.
She sold it under the name of the miraculous oil from the tomb of St. Nicholas of Bari.
This disguise was brilliant. It ensured the poison would be handled with pious respect and completely avoided detection by custom house officers who would never suspect a religious relic.
And her market was immense.
It was. She actually provided the poison free to poor wives who wished to murder their husbands. This reveals a disturbing social reality. A clear, persistent demand existed for an untraceable means of murder, often driven by desperate, trapped domestic situations. She lived for years in monasteries, feigning piety, changing names, all to evade detection.
And across the Alps, we encounter the horror of Madame de Brinvilliers in France, whose campaign was systematic, driven by revenge and avarice.
The Marchioness was intent on inheriting her family's fortune by eliminating her father and 2 brothers. But her methodology is the most disturbing part of the story.
This is where she tests the poisons.
To determine the non-fatal doses that would simulate natural illness, she systematically tested the strength of the poisons on dogs, rabbits, and poor patients in soup at the hospitals.
She was a clinical researcher of murder, ensuring the doses were subtle enough to be undetectable at first, making the poisoning appear like a chronic illness.
Her crimes only came to light when her accomplice, Saint Croix, died, and a box he left was opened. It contained vials of poison and documents, including a paper in her own handwriting detailing the murders.
And this exposure had a terrible side effect.
The book notes, the idea of secret poisoning was first put into the heads of hundreds who afterwards became guilty of it. The very act of reporting the crime spread the methodology, proving that even horrific human behavior can be contagious through the narrative of the extraordinary.
Finally, we turn to the sheer nonsense of false cures and medical delusions, starting with the 17th century weapon salve. This is a profound example of sympathetic magic overriding basic science.
This was a highly influential delusion where the salve was applied to the weapon that caused the injury, not the wound itself. The belief, rooted in Paracelsus's philosophical system, was that the wound would heal through sympathetic connection as the weapon was treated.
And the recipe for the salve is grotesque.
It's a blend of pseudoscience and pure superstition. It included moss growing on the head of a thief who has been hanged, real mummy, warm human blood, and suet.
But the critical yet boring detail that exposes the entire fraud is this.
Surgeons who used the weapon salve also routinely washed and cleaned the wound with water, which was the actual curative step. The magnificent mystical belief masked the mundane yet effective act of simple hygiene and basic sanitation.
This belief set the stage for one of the greatest medical follies, animal magnetism, or mesmerism, championed by Anton Mesmer.
Mesmer initially used external magnets, claiming to restore health by correcting the flow of fluids within the body. This quickly evolved into the concept of a vital, universal magnetic fluid, which could be controlled by the will of the magnetizer.
So it moved from a physical tool to an invisible force.
And that allowed the delusion to move beyond simple mechanics and into pure faith.
The ultimate spiritualization came with the barbarianists.
Right. They believed the influence worked simply by the sheer will of the magnetizer, even across hundreds of miles. The patient didn't need to be present. Only the mental intent of the magnetizer was required.
This pushed the delusion into truly mystical territory.
Culminating in the highest stage, lucid vision. The patient, supposedly asleep to the external world, could see their own internal organs, diagnose others, and became a prophet, a divine. This is the perfect example of human credulity creating a demand for the extraordinary, pushing a pseudoscientific premise into absolute spiritual quackery that defies all natural law.
Our final anecdote brings us back to the most basic form of fraud, amplified by mass credulity. The Cock Lane ghost hoax of 1762.
The fraud was orchestrated by a man named Parsons, who used his daughter and knocking sounds to accuse a Mr. Kent of poisoning a lady named Fanny 2 years prior. The house became a circus, attracting huge crowds and even learned men.
And they believed the ghost communicated by answering questions with knocks.
Yes, 1 knock for no, 2 for yes.
The public examination became a national spectacle. The ghost was asked, "Were you brought to an untimely end by poison?"
Answer, 2 knocks, yes.
How was the poison administered, in beer or in pearl?
Answer, 2 knocks, in pearl. The ghost was systematically confirming the popular narrative of murder.
But the deception began to fray when a crucial witness was asked to confirm a detail.
The ghost claimed that the deceased had told her servant, Carrots, she was poisoned an hour before death. Carrots, who was present at the examination, stated positively that the deceased was speechless an hour before death. The empirical reality of the witness contradicted the fantastical claims of the ghost.
And the final, decisive experiment occurred in the Clerkenwell church vault where Fanny was buried.
The ghost was summoned by Mr. Kent. the alleged murderer to appear, knock, or scratch.
And of course,
Silence. The ghost failed completely. It was summoned, but it appeared not, knocked not, and scratched not. The deception was confirmed, Parsons was exposed and punished, though some deeply superstitious individuals still refused to believe.
they argued the spirit was merely offended by their presumption.
Of course. The key takeaway here is that the only element necessary for a popular delusion to thrive is a small amount of ambiguity and a great deal of enthusiastic willingness to suspend disbelief.
So we've journeyed through centuries, observing manias driven by financial avarice, social aspiration, spiritual terror, and the pursuit of false knowledge.
And what connects John Law's paper currency, the desire for a bearded man's tax receipt, and the application of the weapon salve, is the universal human desire to bypass natural constraints and achieve an extraordinary result through extraordinary means.
They sought a shortcut to wealth without production, a shortcut to honor without merit, and a shortcut to healing without science.
They perpetually choose the wondrously false over the wondrously true. This is captured in the analogy of the sailor's mother. She could not believe in the empirically verifiable reality of a flying fish because her Bible didn't mention it. Yet she firmly believed her son had drawn up a golden and bejeweled wheel from the bottom of the Red Sea because her Bible informed her that Pharaoh was drowned there. The great majority of mankind will believe the more fabulous account simply because it is more akin to their own emotional nature.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. The crowd is highly adaptable. The intense, potent energy of credulity that drove the Mississippi scheme simply shifted objects and became the spiritual hysteria that drove the witch trials.
The fundamental engine of mass belief remains startlingly consistent.
Right. Only the currency, be it paper money, social honor, or spiritual terror, changes.
The moment the majority is gripped by an extraordinary belief, all empirical evidence is set aside, whether it's the financial fraud of the South Sea directors, the medical fraud of the magnetic fluid, or the simple hoax of the Cock Lane ghost. The delusion persists until an undeniable external reality forces the cessation of belief.
The money runs out, the knocks stop.
The failure of the cure becomes fatal.
This raises an important question for you to mull over. These historical delusions ended because external reality, the loss of money, the cessation of knocking, the failure of the cure, eventually broke the spell. What popular delusion that thrives today, whether in finance, medicine, or social belief, is currently insulated from external reality by an enthusiastic majority, awaiting the moment when its own inherent instability finally forces the truth to break through?
Look for the promises that defy natural law, and look for the collective choice of the wondrously false over the wondrously true.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the historical consistency of human folly. Don't forget to subscribe to the Mindset Matters Book Club YouTube channel to hear more comprehensive book summaries and explorations.